Hi, I'm Allegra. Welcome today to my Thursday chat. If you're watching live, awesome. You can comment in the chat section below. If you're watching a recording, wherever you are, feel free to comment. I do see those comments, not always right away, but I do see them and will respond to them as I am able. If you're joining me for the first time, welcome. I am Allegra. My business is called Beyond Your Wildest Dreams, and I am a productivity and time management author, trainer, speaker. I've co-written 4 books, workbooks actually. They're all designed to be read in an hour or less, and they're all designed to get you using the skills that I teach in them immediately, because the brain science shows that when you use information right away, you're much more likely to learn that information. And I don't want you to just listen to me. I want you to actually learn something and acquire a new skill. And today's topic, I'm doing a book summary. This is something new. For those of you who've been around for a while, you know that I'm a voracious reader. I read over 100 books a year. And more than that, those are just the ones I'm able to track because I read or listen to them through my phone. Physical books, I lose count because I don't track that. But over 100 books a year. And I have always wanted to do book summaries because I like to share information that I'm passionate about, and books are one of the things that I'm passionate about. It's the original virtual reality. There's just nothing like a book to have an experience that you couldn't have for yourself, both fiction and nonfiction. I'm actually listening to an interesting Joan Didion book that it's not a book that she meant to publish apparently, because it's a collection of writings from a time when she was traveling through the South in the 70s, and it was published posthumously. But I've been very interested in understanding the American experiences that are so different from my own, because America is such a huge country, and I have lived almost my entire life not only in one state, but in one city. And I recognize that my experience is very localized because of that. And part of being a good citizen is understanding that other citizens might be having different experiences than you. And so I've been wanting to understand the experiences of other Americans, because I really believe the only way we can come together as a country is if we do have some compassion for each other and our different experiences and our shared experiences. And if we think about what it is we want to build in our country, because I do believe that at our most basic, as an anthropologist, as an anthropology student, I recognize that humans as a species, we want a lot of the same things. We want to feel safe and secure, and we want the opportunity to pursue interests that are meaningful to us. And we can only do that if we understand each other. So that's why I'm listening to that book. So today I'm going to talk about a book that I've been listening to as an audiobook called The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, written by science writer Sam Kean. And I love this book, one, because it's just really easy to consume. It is science that reads like a novel. So if you have a difficulty with reading science, I highly recommend this book. And before I get into it, though, I am going to do my usual thing where I pull a card from this deck of cards and talk about whatever it is. I never know because I don't pull in advance. So let's see. What does it say? By being yourself, you put something wonderful in the world that was not there before. Edwin. By being yourself, you put something wonderful in the world that was not there before. Edwin Elliot. Oh, I love this. I really love this because part of why I do the work that I do is to help you understand that you are a unique individual. Yes, we share a lot because we are all the same species, the same type of animal, but the percentages that make us different in profound ways. And I truly believe that we are all here to share a gift and also to learn a lesson. And I find, maybe you find this too, that the lessons, if you don't learn them, life has a way of giving you the opportunity again and again. Have you ever met anyone who seems to have the same experience over and over again? Either literally they have like the same type of injury happen to them, or they have the same kind of person show up in their life, either as someone that they're dating or maybe as a manager. I find this among many people that I know where they have the same experiences over and over again. And the only way I can make sense of it, and maybe it's folly to even try to make sense of it. I will grant you that. However, I am the sort of person who likes to try and make sense of things. And the only way that makes sense to me is that, oh, there's a lesson to be learned there. And they didn't learn it the first time. So they're being presented with another opportunity to learn that lesson. And for that reason, I talk about this in my keynote speech called Forged. I am dedicated to learning the lessons when I'm presented with a challenge, because I have found that when I learn the lesson, it's not repeated. I get to move on. I get to move on from that challenge. I get to level up and move on to the next challenge, whatever that may be. So I really believe that we are all here to share a gift, as Edwin Elliott suggests. We're all here to share something wonderful that was not there before. And part of why I do the work that I do is I want people to investigate their values and their goals and get really clear about what it is in life that they really want, so that you can share that gift. Because in my work, I find that there's so many people, buried under a mountain of shoulds. You should do this. You should look like this. You should buy these clothes. You should want this house. We are buried under all these shoulds that keep us from individuating. They keep us conformed and in these little boxes that are considered socially appropriate. And I saw a wonderful speaker. I was at a conference not yesterday, but the 4 days before that. I was at a really large conference in this Los Angeles area. It was actually held at the LA Convention Center, which, as you can tell from its name, it's a big place. And I saw a wonderful interview there with Bobby Reset. I hope I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. It might be Reset. I think it's French. I don't speak French, so I'm not sure. But Bobby is the former CEO. She just recently she announced at this interview, she announced that she is no longer the CEO. She's now president and founder, and she's stepping away from the day-to-day operations. It was really funny because she said, "I just made the announcement today and they've already removed me from 4 Slack channels." So that's how on top of it her staff was. They were like, "Yep, you're not doing this anymore. You're out of here." But the wonderful thing about Bobby's story is that it was by pursuing those things that make her who she is that she has had so much success. She is the founder of Virtual Gurus, which is a virtual assistant company, but they only hire domestic North American workers. And I know that VAs are something that I have wanted to investigate. However, I have been hesitant to investigate it because due to 2 reasons. One, it felt a little bit exploitive because it seemed like a lot of the reason people were employing VAs was not for the time sharing. Like, for instance, if you have a small business and you don't need someone 40 hours a week, then a VA is a great resource because maybe you only need someone 4 hours a week. Fantastic, a fractional VA essentially. However, a lot of the reasons why people were employing VAs, at least anecdotally as far as I heard, was because they were taking advantage of the fact that there were people living in lower wage countries, and that just felt a little bit exploitive to me. Also, I had also heard some anecdotes about possible scams happening with virtual VAs. So for both of those reasons, it was not something that I investigated. However, Bobby started Virtual Gurus for a very different mission, not just to serve clients, but she really created Virtual Gurus in order to employ people like her. And by like her, she said that when she was looking for a job, she had such horrible interview experiences that there was one time when she was leaving the interviewer's office and she heard her resume hitting the trash can before she even left. And she knew that she had a lot to offer. And so she started doing virtual assisting and built it up to $2 million in revenue before she went out to seek funding to scale it bigger. And now she employs all these people like her, people who might have difficulty being employed. In fact, I was telling her story to somebody who has a friend who is a military wife. And she said, "Oh my gosh, my friend would be perfect for this. You know, she can't really leave the base. She has kids." Bobby says, "Hey, we employ a lot of single moms. We employ people who might live in rural places where it's impossible to get to a city center to be an assistant." Fantastic. All these underemployed people now have opportunities because of Bobby Rissett living her truth, her individuation, putting something wonderful out there in the world. So, yes, wonderful. I love the sentiment, and check out Virtual Gurus. Bobby Rissett is really inspiration, someone to be looked up to. And I didn't even mention that she's an indigenous woman, identifies as queer, you know, might not be the typical person who comes in for an interview and you're like, "You look like an office person." And these are all things that she said herself in her interview. So, the first Indigenous Canadian woman to raise as much money as she raised for Virtual Gurus. So all very exciting. She's so humble. She's not a gatekeeper at all. Asked a question about, "Well, how did you start raising money, going around to banks and everything?" And I love that she self-describes as, "I'm just really annoying. I'm good at following up," which following up, that's the key right there, following up. Okay, so today I'm talking about the book summary of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, and it's a brain science book. I have to look at my notes because there was a lot to take in. And I think the basic thing that I want to leave you with is that if you're curious about understanding how your brain works, as I am, this is a great place to start. I read a lot of books, some of them autobiographies, some of them just straight up science about the brain. And this is a great introduction to the brain, from the chemical through the history of neurosurgery to more recent developments. It's kind of a little bit of a chronological book in terms of going from historical, the beginning of brain surgery. Really fascinating. And the other thing I want to leave you with too is that this book really makes it clear just how complicated, just how many things have to go right for us to show up as, quote unquote, functional humans. There's so many things that can go wrong. I forget which book. I read these two books back to back, so I conflate the information sometimes. One is the Best Minds or something. I have to find it. Yes, The Best Minds, Jonathan Rosen. And then the other one is the Hidden Valley Road. So Hidden Valley Road by Robert Coker and The Best Minds. I read those two books back to back, so sometimes I conflate the information. I should do summaries on those too. Anyway, in one of those books, they explained that the new thinking around schizophrenia, because both of these books delve deep into schizophrenia. One, The Best Minds, is about a man who succeeded in going to an Ivy League law school and having a very high profile job for a good amount of time, all while suffering from extreme delusions that eventually, unfortunately, he was not able to control. He controlled them for many years, or I guess not control is the right word. He lived with them for many years. And then the other book, The Hidden Valley Road, is about 12 biological siblings. So they have the same father, same mother. The first 10 were all brothers. The last 2 were sisters, which is part of why they had 12, because they kept trying for daughters. And 6 of the brothers were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so, of course, they were a very interesting model to the scientific world in terms of studying the nature-nurture aspects of schizophrenia. And as I mentioned, I don't remember which book said this, but one of those 2 books said that the new thinking about schizophrenia, and really not just schizophrenia, but a lot of mental health issues, is that there aren't these distinct diseases the way they used to think. And one of the authors suggests that, 100 years ago, a fever was thought of as a specific disease. And now we understand that a fever is just a symptom of the body fighting something, and it can be many different things that it's fighting. So now they're realizing that symptoms like delusions are not, oh, this one specific gene is malfunctioning when you have schizophrenia, and that's what creates delusions. Because what they did was they sequenced a number of people suffering or who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the genes that were impacted in these people were all different. And apparently there are hundreds of genes. And so there were just like hundreds of opportunities for things, I guess, firing in a less than ideal way. And ideal, I don't like the word ideal because it carries a judgment with it. Like, the reality is just we're all extremely different from each other. Going back to this by being yourself, you put something wonderful in the world. We're all extremely different. I mean, there are stories of people who live more traditional lives, cultures who live more traditional lives, and they have, people who have visions. Maybe those were people who had this specific firing in a gene that would now get diagnosed as, having some sort of mental illness. And again, I don't like the word illness either because it has a little bit of a judgment. There are traits that are harder to live with as a human, and there are traits that maybe are easier to live with as a human, but it's just variety. There's just a ton of variety when you hear this book or when you read this book. You'll see just how many different ways your brain can malfunction or change. And this can be because of emotional trauma. This can be because of physical trauma. This can be because of aging that naturally causes chemical changes in your body. So your brain will change in your lifetime. It's kind of inevitable. But this book will help you kind of prepare for that, if you will. Like, I always believe that it's a lot easier to manage something that you know is coming than, oh my gosh, why does it feel like my brain is working so differently? And I went through a long period of being way more tired than I was used to, of noticing that it took a little bit longer to find that word. There were a few years in there, and I wasn't quite sure what to attribute it to because a lot of things happened at the time. If you've heard me talk before, you'll know that I've been perimenopausal for over a decade. Also, in 2020, of course, COVID and all of that happened. So there's the changes in how society was functioning. And then also my father passed. So all of those things together, it was hard to know what was causing what. But there was a period where I just had to sleep a lot. And I recently heard something about how as we age, and I don't know if it's just women or men because I have not researched it more, but I want to look into this, but that as we age, our brain actually changes its preferred source of energy. You might hear like, oh, the brain needs sugar, sugar, sugar. But apparently, at some point, it switches more to ketones, and that era of switching takes years and can be very disruptive to your thinking. So now I'm wondering, maybe my brain was going through that. The great news is apparently you do come out the other side where your brain is like, okay, I'm used to that. If you think about it, it's like if your car suddenly decided to switch from from using diesel to using regular gas. It's like that would be a challenging ride. If you've ever put the wrong gas in your car, you know. Okay, so let's get into some specifics about the Dueling Neurosurgeons, some things that I liked, that I took away from it that I thought were really interesting. One of the things that it really explains really clearly is how your brain fires. And there's a shorthand that Sam Kean mentions, which it's kind of reverse alphabetical. It's DCBA. And this is a way of explaining how neurons communicate. Neurons only communicate in one direction. So if you think of them like a daisy chain of cells, the information only goes in one direction, and it's D to CB to A. D, dendrite, to CB, cell body, to A, axon. And then from there, it repeats. So D to CB to A, and then the axon will communicate with the next dendrite. And what they found is that it's actually the neurons don't actually touch each other, which is what I think is really interesting. The axon and the dendrites, they don't touch. So let's say this is an axon and this is the dendrite. The neurons release chemicals that wash over to the next dendrite and they pick up the chemicals. So there's not actually touching here, which I thought was so interesting. I'd always thought of neurons kind of as a highway, an uninterrupted highway. But really, there's this gap that gets filled with chemicals. So fascinating. And the interesting thing about these chemicals is that they're so powerful, they can cause things to happen even when an organ or whatever is no longer functioning. So, for instance, this one scientist did this experiment where he had two hearts. I believe they were frog hearts. And depending on the chemicals that he introduced, he could make the hearts speed up and slow down. But what he also found was that if he sped one up and then took the chemical that that heart had produced and then put it on the slowed down heart, it would make that heart speed up. So it's not just, I guess this is where whatever chemicals that we give, maybe it's, what's the one, the adrenaline, these types of chemicals. That's why you can restart a heart. But these are all chemicals that are naturally produced as well as artificially produced. I thought that was really fascinating. There are over 100 different types of neurotransmitters. In my trainings, I always talk a lot about dopamine because I'm trying to teach people. And dopamine is, first of all, it's the brain's way of saving information. So, when something really dramatic happens, like we don't tend to remember what we ate every single day. But let's say you have a really good meal and you have a really good experience. Some dopamine gets released and then that saves it in your brain. And, all of my trainings that I do, I always try to be very engaging because I know that if I can release dopamine in other people, they're more likely to learn what it is I'm trying to teach. However, dopamine can also be counterproductive because it's also the achievement chemical. Like when you do something, you're like, oh, I did a good job. Yay. Some dopamine gets released. And so I also often talk about how to purposefully release dopamine, but not too much dopamine because you can feel that you've accomplished something when you haven't actually. It can be counterproductive. So I tend to focus on that one a lot. There are 4 that I frequently talk about. I had no idea there were 100 different neurotransmitters, because there are a number of them that just don't apply to what I do. But one of the ones he was talking about how some neurotransmitters can actually do, all neurotransmitters do multiple things, but sometimes they can also do things that seem counter to each other. So, for instance, this one neurotransmitter that he discussed that gets released as we're going to bed, he didn't name it, so I don't know what the name of it is, but it actually both excites and inhibits at the same time. So it seems, counterproductive that it's doing two things, but it excites the brain to get ready for sleep, but then it paralyzes. It sends out, a signal that helps the brain to then send signals to our limbs to paralyze ourselves. And that's what keeps most of us from sleepwalking. Our limbs are literally paralyzed. So I thought that was really fascinating. 100 different transmitters. He also had a really lengthy section about the plasticity of the brain, and plasticity is the understanding that our brains are endlessly changeable, endlessly. I remember when I was growing up, there was this belief that around, as I also studied linguistics in school, that around 13 was kind of when the ability to acquire a language just ended. And we now know the brain is way more plastic than that. And that if you've studied anything to do with the growth mindset, I highly recommend it. Carol Dweck wrote a book called The Growth Mindset. Great book. And basically, it's about the main takeaway is that whether or not your brain is able to learn new things really has to do with whether or not you believe your brain can do new things, because it's all about having a growth mindset that allows you to take on those new things. Your brain, it's funny, your brain kind of wants to do whatever it is you want it to do. So if you're like, "Meow, I'm an old dog, I can't learn new tricks," your brain's like, okay, sure. And if you say, no, I can always learn, then your brain also says, okay, let's do it. So he gives this example of these people who take this one medication. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I wrote it with a G, but I don't know if that's ge or G. Gentamicin. So apparently it's this drug that is known to destroy the little hairs in your inner ear that help with balance. So apparently there are these little hairs in there, and the way liquid moves over them kind of acts like a level to our brain, keeping us upright, or if we're tilting to the side, reminding us to move this way because of the way the hairs are tickled. When the hairs are destroyed, that leveling can no longer happen. And so a number of people who have these inner hairs destroyed, they can't go out in society because everything is so disorienting. And it's really sad because apparently a number of people commit suicide because it just makes daily life so hard. But what they showed is that they can actually do retraining of the brain to help people reorient themselves without having these hairs. And it has to do with something with electricity on the tongue. And so I guess you do this training where you have some sort of sparking that happens on your tongue. I guess they put a probe. He didn't explain it in a way that I can that I can feel like I can relay to you, but something to do with, you put something on your tongue, and as you lean to the side, it'll buzz you to remind you to return to center. And then when you're in center, it doesn't do anything. And then as you lean to the side, it buzzes you. And apparently with enough training, this actually rewires the brain to, I guess, remember what standing upright feels like. And some people can just go about with their lives. So I thought that was really, really fascinating. Another interesting example of brain plasticity is the fact that areas that you might think of as not getting stimulated. So, for instance, someone who is vision impaired or even blind, one would think that maybe the vision area of the brain is not firing. However, what has been shown is that people who practice echolocation, which is what bats and dolphins do, right? They use sound bouncing off of objects to orient themselves. And there are people, if you've never seen this, it's really fascinating. People who can completely move around with freedom through echolocation. And he talks at great length about one person who does it very well, and that person's trial and tribulations echolocating. It's really interesting. But when this person, this really accomplished echolocator, when his brain was scanned, it was shown that his vision area was firing when he echolocates. And the hypothesis is that vision, the vision area of the brain, is not just about what we can see through here, but that it also helps to serve with our orientation of ourselves in our surroundings. At least that's the hypothesis, right? Like, science is wonderful, but understanding exactly what's happening, it's not like there's a manual up in the sky where we'll be able to read, like, oh, yes, that one section of the brain, it does this. You know, these are all our best informed understanding, but that the vision section does fire when you're echolocating. Another thing that I thought was really interesting was when he discussed phantom limbs and people who maybe have had amputations and they still feel sensation in the limbs. And what was found is that if your brain sees that there's a part of its space that's dedicated, let's say there's an area in your brain that is dedicated to your hands. And if you no longer have hands and the brain notices, like, hey, there's some unoccupied space there, I'm going to use that space to wire it to stuff happening with your face. And apparently, there's an area of your brain where your face and your hand actually are close together. And so what they found is that, let's say someone has the left hand amputated and then they scratch an area on their face, they feel the left hand and they understand now that that's why. It's because the face part has recolonized the area that used to be occupied by the left hand, and it's stimulating that left hand brain area when you're touching your face. But they've also shown that through a therapy called mirror box therapy, they can help retrain the brain to understand there is no left hand anymore. You don't need to fire that anymore, because some people will feel pain in the amputated limb that can be very disconcerting. And so there is some training available to help with that. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it there because honestly, this book is so dense. It has so much information. Fantastic. Hopefully, I've piqued your interest. You should definitely read it. It is a wonderful book. And if you're interested in finding out how to work with me, either to bring me out to your company or to work one-on-one, visit my website, bywdreams.com. Also, you can, if you are interested in bringing me out to your company, I have another website, inspireinformignite.com, that can give you more information. And I will see you next 30. I will see you next Thursday. And remember that planning makes everything easier. Thank you.